May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our Redeemer and Savior. Today's gospel is kind of a strange one. After Jesus' birth, his family's flight into Egypt as a baby to avoid the slaughter of the innocents, after his return to Israel, to Nazareth, we get almost nothing in the canon until the start of his ministry, maybe 30 years later. Okay, there is a single episode in the temple, but very little in there about his growing up, his adolescence, and for that matter, his early adulthood. The early church didn't consider the storytelling and myths of Jesus growing up and maturing to be anywhere near as important as what he said during his ministry, what he did during his passion, and, of course, his resurrection. The gospel writer for today's reading, St. John, picks up the story with Jesus' baptism by the other John, John the Baptist, Jesus' calling of the first disciples, and what might look like a rather odd interaction with Nathanael. The Revised Common Lectionary for Year C skips lightly over that conversation, but I'd like to remind you, as indeed I myself was reminded, that Nathanael was from Cana, a then small village a few miles from Nazareth. And as we heard in today's reading, it was at Cana that Jesus performed his first miracle. And also, later on, though it's not in the Common Lectionary, in chapter 4, Jesus heals a young boy's fever in Cana. But what do we know about Cana? We aren't even sure which of 4 or 5 contemporary candidate locations was where the wedding was held. The top 4 are in Upper Galilee, Cana in Lebanon, in Lower Galilee, Kafir Kama, Israel, Hirbat Cana, Israel, and Ain Cana, Israel. We don't even know what kind of village it was, but apparently it did have a much better reputation than Nazareth. In the Nathanael story, Nathanael says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" This is not a real strong recommendation for the quality of the place. We don't know how many people lived in Cana, though that hasn't stopped people from speculating. I'm not immune from that either, and my guess is that we're talking at most about a couple hundred people. And whether it was 4 miles or 9 miles from Nazareth, it would have been rather a hike for Mary, Jesus, and the disciples. It's not flat country. So the wedding celebration was not just a small local village party, but a significant community event for some of those who lived further away than just down the street. John's telling of the event is very terse. There are almost no unneeded words in it. It's really tightly edited. There's a wedding. Mary, Jesus, and Jesus' disciples, possibly not even the full count of 12 yet, they were all invited. And as then as now, there's wine at it. People are celebrating. They want to be happy, not to mention occasionally getting drunk. There was wine, but it ran out. And whether it was the host didn't buy enough, or that more people showed up at the celebration than had been expected, or that the people drank more than is expected, we don't know. And John does not tell us. But Mary, whom John repeatedly calls the mother of Jesus, rather than giving her name, noticed and told Jesus. Well, Jesus reply seems a little harsh. What concern is that to me and to you? My hour has not yet come. Mary doesn't command or argue. She just tells the servants to do whatever Jesus tells them to do. Jesus tells the servants to fill 6 stone jars with water. John doesn't tell us whether they were empty or merely not full. All of those are almost irrelevant details anyway, and as I said, John was being really tight in his writing. What the gospel calls Jewish rites of purification actually just seemed to be hand washing and dishwashing, which were part of everyday Jewish life. They're probably part of today's life, although we don't use 20 or 30 gallon stone jars. But the water was put into the jars, so they were filled to the brim. So there they are, the servants, the disciples, and Jesus. He says to them, now draw some out and take it to the person in charge of the banquet. So they took it. Doesn't get any plainer or simpler than that. The surprise, of course, comes in the next 2 verses. When the person in charge tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, that person called the bridegroom said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now. John kind of slips in the bit about the water that had become wine, almost as a side comment before he gets any further. He just sort of slides that in, almost unnoticed. The disciples, on the other hand, were blown away. It's quite clear that they'd never seen anything like that. So a few comments on the story. Mary sees a problem and presents the problem to Jesus. She doesn't tell him what to do, but she does expect him to do something appropriate. And how could she not? She's been, quote, in on the secret since before Jesus was born. Other preachers have suggested that this request of Mary's is a good model for petitionary prayer asking God for something. She didn't ask for a specific solution. She just put it in Jesus' hands. The second observation, Jesus used what was at hand. He didn't whistle up a troop of angels. He didn't send a runner to the local vineyard. He didn't call DoorDash. He just saw 6 large jars, like many homes and meeting places would have had for the washing up before meals. With Jesus, what is present and available is enough. You might compare that with the feeding of the 5,000. For what's available is enough. Third point, for a miracle, this one's pretty low-key. Jesus doesn't make a big deal out of it, doesn't distract the wedding guests. He just does what's needed. The disciples noticed it, though, and were wowed. Now, the next one is being picky, I'm afraid. Some commentators have quibbled or cavilled about the quantity of miraculously created wine. Essentially, they say that only the sample taken to the person in charge of the wine had been changed from water into wine, not the whole 100 gallons plus of water in the jars. Hey, if a miracle had occurred, is it not a bit chintzy to place an artificial limit on it? A miracle happened, even if it's just a sample or 100 gallons. This is not the normal course of things. God is a God of abundance and generosity. And another observation, Jesus' miraculous changing of water into wine was not just for his family and followers. All the people at the wedding in a village where he didn't live benefited from it. Likewise, his redemption is intended for all people. Next point. The Athanasian Creed says Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is completely God, completely human. And this short story illustrates his humanity: a mother, relatives, and friends celebrating a wedding. Helping is needed and asked. And a final observation on the story itself. Just like in many of God's interactions with people, one of God's most wonderful creations, water, was intimately involved. From the creation, when the Spirit of God moved over the waters, to the crossing of the Red Sea, to John's baptism in the Jordan River, to washing the disciples' feet, turning water into wine is quite in line with God's activities. Now I'm going to switch from the gospel reading for today and make a few comments about one of the underlying themes there, which is miracles. These days, miracles is kind of an overused word, and that has kind of drained it of impact. We get, if you go to the store, you can see Miracle Grow plant fertilizer. You can get Miracle White in the cosmetic dental department. And you turn on the TV and you see ads for the Children's Miracle Network. People want to be impressive. They want to impress you. They want to stress this, so they overuse the word. Then we've got movies and TV, computer-generated images, special effects. They can show you things that never happen and can never happen. And they can show things that did happen or could happen, but are off by means of scale or the power involved. They can, for example, freeze New York City under 1,000 feet of ice. Not really, but the scale and the power of something like that can be pretty significant. Another word which has been slowly sapped of all its impact is resurrection. It's used so much in popular fiction and in video games and in card games and this and that and the other thing that it's sort of lost some of its awesome impact. And oh, by the way, there's another word for you that's overused: awesome. These days it just means, oh, that's pretty good. So let's think about miracles a little bit. In antiquity, it was mostly used to impress people, to demonstrate power to do something that they might not want. So, for example, you have Moses first encountering God in the burning bush and getting enough of his attention that he wanders away from his sheep that he's been entrusted with. You have Moses and the miracles in front of Pharaoh leading to the Exodus. God's pulling his people out of Egypt after having had to sort of beat Pharaoh over the head with a 2x4 in terms of miracles. And that raises another side point on there: magic. Because Pharaoh had his court magicians, and they could do some of the things that Moses was doing. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us how they did that. It's a pretty good guess that it's pretty much the forerunner of today's stage magic. And anybody who's seen a magic act can be pretty impressed by how real it seems. Actually, it's pretty much all trickery. Another miracle from the Old Testament, the showdown with the priests of Baal. They're saying, okay, we're going to have a showdown here. We're going to see whose offering gets accepted by the descent of fire. Well, nothing happens until the prayer to the one true God happens, and then there's essentially an explosion of fire on the altar. I'm pretty sure that the prophet didn't quite expect what to happen, what did. He knew something was going to happen. He went around and threw water on the whole offering and the pyre underneath it. But he didn't know what was going to happen. He certainly didn't cause it to happen. He just asked. Now, there's a joke that I was told a number of years ago, or a story about an anthropologist visiting a primitive tribe somewhere in an unspecified area. I think the story is apocryphal, about trying to impress the natives getting there. And so one of the things he does is he pulls out an instant camera, a Polaroid, takes a picture, and people are going, we've got people who can make pictures. There's nothing weird or impressive about that. Yeah, it's a little faster than we do, but pictures are an ordinary, everyday sort of thing. So the anthropologist scratches his head and says, what can I do to impress these people? And you can tell the age of the story by the fact that the guy pulls out a cigarette and a cigarette lighter and lights the cigarette without thinking about it. At which point, all the natives get wide-eyed and impressed. This guy can generate fire from his fingertips. Wow! So miracles sort of depend on who's looking and what the context is. Now, when St. John, the author of the Gospel, writes about the miracles, he has a particular idea in mind as to just what they're about. In fact, he calls them signs that point to the nature of Jesus. And those are signs not only to the disciples who see this and say, oh, this is more than we thought we were getting into, but also to John's readers, both back in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and for that matter, today. These are told that you may believe. And that gets us to another area of problems with words. I mentioned already miracle as a word that has been overused and drained of its significance. I mentioned awesome, but there are a few other words that fall into that category too. First one is believe. John says that the disciples believed, but he doesn't go into any detail about what or how they believed. Second one, glory. Now that's one of those words which is kind of slippery in the first place. You can go out and watch a glorious sunset, or you can see the Grand Canyon in all its glory. Or you can watch a ceremony that's glorious. But even there, the main point of the glory is not in the external part, but in the reactions of the person seeing it. If you don't see the glory, you really don't appreciate it. It isn't glorious. How about a few other words there? How about holy? How about spirit and soul? Do we really even agree what we're talking about? Or for that matter, can you just off the top of your head draw the distinction between spirit and soul? And one final comment about the words here. I think that probably in a lot of cases, the more appropriate word for a lot of what people use the word miracle for is marvel. Because you can marvel at something without it being extraordinary, never seen before, or impossible. You can marvel at somebody's grace in the Olympics. You can marvel at the strength of, or the size of a skyscraper. You can marvel at the impressive cure done by standard modern medicine. I wouldn't necessarily call it miraculous. People do healings with modern medical technology on a daily basis all over the world. You can still marvel at it. So, what do we take away from all of this? This story is an almost perfect miniature in the gospel. And there's an awful lot that you can pull out of it. I've gone on far too long talking about these few verses in the Gospel of John, but I recommend that you do what the prayer book says for all of these. Read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. Amen.